Welcome back to another edition of the Edge Podcast. Managing editor Brenden Slaughter, joined as always by my recruiting analyst Jared Halus, and we are here for another edition of the Edge Podcast. Got some really good news to talk about. Oregon State officially hired their new running back coach. AJ Steward is the guy. Jared and I are going to break it down and talk about it in detail over the course of this podcast. But just right off the cuff, Jared, how excited or surprised? What was your reaction from this hire? As we'll get into talking about AJ Steward.
I don't think I was too surprised. You look at running back coaches in the Pac-12 in particular, and there's really not been many coaching vacancies recently in the conference until you look at Arizona. So, you kind of had to know that he was at least going to be a candidate, somebody that they were going to talk to one way or the other. And it's hard to say. I think it was a great hire. You've mentioned a few times that Petrie came from, where was it, Montana State? So I mean, I think being able to pull somebody else from a Pac-12 program is honestly pretty impressive.
Yeah, and obviously we'll get into the nuts and bolts, but just right off the bat here, the AJ Steward, kind of file, so to speak, is, as Jared mentioned, he was recently on Kevin Sumlin's staff in 2020 at Arizona after coming over from BYU, where he was in 2018-19. And before that, spent some time at Rice from 2014 to 2017. I know the reaction from some of the subscribers in the damn board and even just around were a little surprised, just where he was coming from. But you have to consider this possibility was the thing that came off right away. What he did at Arizona this last year, Arizona was a disaster. Mm-hmm. Like Arizona football was a disaster in 2020. Kevin Sumlin fired obviously midway through the year, and they, really limp towards the end of the season, and, they statistically weren't great, just a really bad year. So a bad sample size. So I don't really look too much at what, Arizona did specifically this last year, even though, the Wildcats typically have a pretty good ground game. You talk about Gary Brightwell, and we'll get into a little bit later what our sister site, goazcats.com, and publisher Matt Moreno said about Steward. But just right off the cuff, I don't think you can look at that Arizona sample size from last year and go, well, Arizona finished 8th in the league and near the bottom in rushing touchdowns. What is this guy? I don't see it that way at all.
No, I mean, you can't. I mean, like you said, it's a super small sample size. If it was something where that was something that was happening on a, consistent basis, then sure, I could see where you're coming from. But as you mentioned, the program in general last year was just in a bad place.
Yep.
And so,
and Beaver fans know how that goes. It happens sometimes.
Absolutely. So you can't just look at the running back coach and point a finger at him for all the things that went wrong offensively or in their running game or whatever. And especially a first-year running back coach there, as you mentioned, he's got experience at other schools too. But his first year there, he's not the guy to point a finger at when it comes to stuff like that. So I'm more on your side there, where it's like, okay, let's give the guy a chance.
Yeah, the thing that's intriguing to me is I look at it the other way and I go, okay, well, here's a guy who didn't have any Pac-12 experience and got Pac-12 experience. So it's not like you're hiring, even Michael Petrie didn't have Pac-12 experience. Now you're talking about a guy in Steward who, even though, Kevin Sumlin got fired this year, someone who still is a very respected coach, in the circles for where he's been, and, it didn't work out at Arizona. So someone obviously saw something in Steward, hiring him over from Kalani Sitake's staff, who, Beaver fans all too familiar with when Kalani Sitake was hired from Oregon State when he was their defensive coordinator the first year of the Anderson era, and, same kind of thing. So you go back to his time at BYU, and that's where it gets to be impressive for me is, his backfield in 2019 averaged 4.5 yards a carry. They had 25 touchdowns. They had 159 rushing yards per game. They went to a bowl game year before, very similar numbers, a few more touchdowns, a little bit less in per game numbers. But what he was able to do at BYU with their running backs in those 2 seasons, and we'll get into, Rice previously before that momentarily, but BYU is the sample size that I like to look at because BYU's been a pretty solid program these last couple of years under Kalani Sitake. And, obviously Kalani saw something in hiring Steward away from Rice.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting hire, and one that I was personally kind of, I don't want to say excited about, because there is such a small sample size to look at, but, just at least optimistic about.
Right.
And I think he could be a super good fit at Oregon State. As you mentioned, we'll get into what Mr. Matt said about him later on, but he's got a clear ability to coach the guys and develop relationships. And when it comes to coaching and recruiting, those are the two things you're really looking at.
Right. And the interesting thing that I want to touch on in this as well is that, he comes over and was not one of those candidates that we looked at who already had recruiting coordinator attached to his title. That wasn't, something that he held at Arizona. Jared, do you imagine another staffer will kind of take up that role in the meantime? And maybe, I think about someone like maybe on the defensive, maybe Trent Bray grows into that role. Maybe Kafense Hinson grows into that role. Maybe, I'm just trying to think off the cuff, but what do you think Jonathan Smith is thinking there with this hire? Or do you think simply that they put that as like the carrot, the incentive on Steward's contract saying, hey, you do well in the first year, your backs perform well, you land some big recruits. This is something that could be available for you in a year or 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, that could be something that they kind of threw a line out and said something like that. But I definitely don't think it's his right away. And it's hard to say who could get it. I think you named some good candidates of guys who would probably be some front runners for that role. But, we'll see what happens with Stewart. I doubt when Petrie got there, everybody was saying that he would end up being the guy, the closer,
Yep.
that ends up making all the big splash lands. So it's just a thing where time's going to have to be the telling factor. And I personally think it could be a great hire.
Yeah, and that it's interesting that you bring that up because we had a lot of, people on the damn board yesterday that were, concerned about the hire and, brought up, Petrie and whatnot. And I even put that on our board and said, if Petrie came from Montana State, let's just start there. Secondly, if Michael Petrie was at the time this dominant, heralded recruiter who was plucking dominant talent out of California left and right, he wouldn't have come to a program that was coming off a 1-11 season and was in shambles. He'd been hired by a big time school. Right? Boom. Easy peasy, done and done. So when I look at that, I go, Smith saw long-term potential. He knew that if he put someone who maybe was one of the more aggressive and, I'm trying to pick my words, rightly here to describe it, but aggressive, tenacious, those kind of things on a staff and looking for maybe those intangibles and then giving them, a proper Power 5 place to succeed. You could argue that Steward was, a Power 5 quality running back coach and just didn't get put in the position to succeed in Tucson. Granted, no coach was. That's why they were all fired and they're starting off fresh. But the fact that Kevin Sumlin felt that he was ready to be in the Pac-12 last year, and again, Arizona had a really solid rushing attack for several years now, going all the way back to the Rich Rodriguez days. So, that leads me to believe that, Kevin Sumlin saw that in him. And obviously, I'm sure it was Kevin Sumlin's plan to be there a lot longer and probably keep Stewart as his running back coach a lot longer. So I see it now as Smith goes, hey, I can grab this guy who I think has some of those intangibles. And when we put him in a really comfortable, stable, emphasis on stable position at Oregon State where you don't have to look over your shoulder of, getting canned. And I think that's kind of what led a lot of these Arizona staffers, as the year kind of went along. I mean, when your head coach gets let go, you all kind of know the writing on the wall from that point on what's going to happen. So all in all, I think it's a very intriguing hire, and I'm excited to, get to talk to him in spring practices and, the videos that I've been able to watch, him breaking down film at like BYU and Arizona. He's very knowledgeable, and I'm excited about the hire. I really am.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think you made a good point there. I think Sumlin obviously saw something in him to bring him around, and he's a young guy who's continuing to trend upwards in his career. Things are going right for him, and this could definitely be, just the leap that he needed. Where, like you said, he's got stability
Yep.
and a place where there's not going to be. I mean, yes, there's going to be big expectations, but not like absolutely massive expectations where he's got to worry about, okay, if I don't get a 5-star this recruiting cycle,
Exactly.
somebody's coming for my neck. That's not going to happen. If you can go find an in-state gym, or it's not even that as much as just the development of the guys as well. Like I don't know if anybody saw guys like AP and Jamar turning
Right.
into what they did, but they did. And that's what made Coach Petrie so special, along with the fact that he could land some super good recruits. So, the yes, Petrie is a great coach, but it's not like the bar is extremely high where he can't meet it or surpass the same level of success that Petrie did. So,
Right.
again, I'm optimistic about it, and I'm excited to see what he can do.
Yeah, the last point I want to mention on this, but then we'll pivot over to you, Jared, to talk about what you were able to learn from Matt Moreno over at goazcats.com, our sister station down there, in our sister site, excuse me, down there in Tucson. But the last thing I kind of want to touch on is, we had a lot of edgers that were like, Petrie came into Corvallis, even though he came from Montana State, very well connected in California because he played at UCLA. And that's understandable. You're not going to be able to replace that instantaneous California connection with this hire. I get that. But in the case of Steward, I look back at it as an opportunity to potentially expand your recruiting horizons. You look at how the Beavers have been able to develop a pipeline, or not. Let's take a step back. Starting to voyage into maybe having a bit of a pipeline into Texas, right? I think about a guy like Stewart, who spent a lot of time at Rice. All of a sudden, now you have a Midwest connection. Now you have more than just Kefense Hinson down there in the Midwest who can maybe go help out in Texas. Maybe there's a kid in Oklahoma, maybe Kansas. You never know, but you look at where he's kind of moved gradually towards the West as time's come. So go back to Rice when he kind of had that Midwest, and you go to BYU where you're kind of specifically recruiting what BYU is looking for. Obviously, that's a little bit of a unique situation, but still, searching for talent primarily, ideally on the West Coast and potentially anywhere because that's BYU's unique in that regard. And then over to Arizona. So, I think it's something he can grow into is kind of my overarching point in this is that he has been in some different places than what maybe the rest of Oregon State staff has been. It's not super common for them to, bring someone who hasn't been coaching like on the West Coast exclusively. So with that, I look at this as Jonathan Smith is maybe bringing in someone who maybe just brings a different perspective to the staff in all aspects. And that's not to say that Stewart can't walk in and, start to dominate in California. I hope he can. And, when you combine that with, what the Beavers have had, it's decent. But I look at, most of the staff is pretty comfortable in California. Maybe they wanted to just expand the reach a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And as you mentioned, that's something that kind of Matt was able to give us some insight towards just his recruiting areas in general. And, you touched on it really well there, just saying they now have another person. Yes, Petrie was really well versed in the California area, but so are other Oregon State coaches.
Right.
So that area is not as hard to fill per se as something like a Midwest kind of connection guy would be. So I think having this guy here is going to be amazing for that reason because I've seen them make a lot of offers in those areas. The Utahs, and they do well in those areas like Utah, Arizona, Colorado, places like that. And there's talent in those states. And this just opens up a whole new plethora of people for them to be able to go for. And, he's going to bring a lot of relationships with him from Arizona to here. And that we'll have to wait and see. But I think, like you said, I mean, it definitely opens up some new opportunities. And, other Oregon State coaches will have the opportunity to really start to hammer on California. And this isn't to say that Stewart won't be able to do that either. But he can still do that while maintaining and continuing to grow the relationships that he's built in that Midwest area.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I'm the more and more I sit on this hire, I look at this as Jonathan Smith not only got his guy, but he got someone who's going to bring a different lens to the staff. It's just new perspectives are always a good thing, especially the Beavers now going into, year 4 of the Smith regime. Bringing in someone who can maybe just, you look at something like this, and then you look at it like this. It's just you shake it up a little bit, and it could be the difference that turns into making Stewart. I'm not going to say not miss a beat, but to an extent be able to absorb the loss and adjust and perhaps recruit in a new way. You know what I mean? It's everyone's different, and you're not going to be able to replace Michael Petrie. That's just facts. I mean, the guy went to the Chicago Bears for a reason, from Corvallis, Oregon. So he was special, but Jonathan Smith found him once. So I have confidence that Jonathan Smith found someone else here that's got, high upside. So, I'm feeling good about it. And, you guys should feel a lot more good about it too. Once we talk to Jared, who caught up with Matt Moreno from goazcats.com. Jared, tell us and tell the edgers out there and everyone watching, what did Matt say about Steward? Obviously Matt Moreno, publisher for Go Easy Cats, which was where Steward spent the 2020 season. What's kind of your impression from Matt, and what was Matt able to tell you about AJ?
Yeah, it really gave me a ton of clarity. When I reached out to Matt, I didn't expect necessarily to even hear what I heard or to get the response back that I did. And I think it did put a lot of our subscribers at ease when they read that. And basically what he said, in short, I'll summarize it just because it was a lot.
Yep.
It's just that he's a relationship builder, and he's a guy that's able to establish connections quickly with people. He got to Arizona and instantly became a player favorite on the coaching staff, developed some great bonds with all the guys, and just made a really impressive impression on all the fans and the players in general. So in that front, he's got it covered. Again, we talked about recruiting a little bit a second ago, but he also landed or played a big role in landing some of Arizona's top commits in last year's class. Now, it wasn't the best class they've had in ages, but still, the guy comes in and is automatically one of the best recruiters on the class for the year that he was there. So, I mean, to me, there was, just judging off from what I heard from Matt, it was all fantastic stuff. And again, I think it put a lot of people at ease and at rest, and probably made a lot of people excited about who's coming to coach the running backs.
Yeah, and I think there were some great points in there from Matt, and just having that kind of clarity and kind of look behind the curtain, so to speak, at what Steward was able to do in Arizona. I think that will certainly be something that Beaver fans are excited about, and just to kind of put a bow tie on this AJ Steward conversation, definitely not someone I expected. I was but leave it to Smith. That's exactly what I kind of expected was, it was either going to be one of these, names that we thought, or somebody just completely off our radar. And in the case of Stewart, I can't say that, many, if any at all, saw him coming. And now that I've had time to settle on it and sleep on it for a night and research him and adjust and all those things, I've come to the conclusion that I think he's a really solid hire, and I can't wait to see what he can do with a pretty good crop of running backs, Jared. I mean, what the Beavers have right now, it's solid. I mean, I'm not going to say it's great yet, but it's right now at least solid. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what that group can do with Stewart in spring.
That's a really good point there. I mean, he is coming into what's a good group, but I think it's also important to note that it's a pretty young and inexperienced group at this point as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You don't have a massive expectation because people understand or should understand that you're working with guys who don't have a lot of experience. But at the same time, think about if somebody like Isaiah Newell or Demir Collins or anybody is able to just light it up next year. Everybody is going to fall in love with this guy.
Yep.
That's the opportunity that he has here, and I'm sure he took that into consideration when he made the decision to take the job.
Certainly. And then you toss in the addition of a Deshaun Fenwick. You just casually have a guy who was doing pretty good in the SEC, right? And then you toss in the experience of AJ Baylor, and obviously, like you said, Isaiah Newell, Tayron Madison, who hasn't gotten much of a run yet. Trey Lowe will be in the mix next year. If I was AJ Steward and I saw this crop of running backs, I'd be like, yeah, I can work with this. What do you think?
Yeah, he can definitely work with it. Again, it's an inexperienced group, but it's certainly a talented group. So with some good coaching, they could make some things happen this year.
Certainly. And, that'll go ahead and wrap up our conversation on AJ Steward. As Oregon State announced him yesterday as their new running backs coach. We'll wait to see exactly when his introductory press conferences or when the Beavers make him available. Definitely be looking forward to those conversations. And just to wrap up the podcast, got a couple little howdy do things to kind of close out with, talking men's and women's basketball and then baseball, just brief little updates before we wrap up. So starting over with men's basketball, the Beavs split this last weekend, winning against Utah, falling against Colorado. They're back in action this weekend on the road, taking on Cal and Stanford, as they've got 4 games left in their conference schedule, sitting at 11-11 overall. And then the Oregon State women's basketball team, huge win this past weekend, knocking off number 8 UCLA and also beating USC to sweep the LA road trip and really put themselves back in the position firmly to be in the postseason. They're 8-6 overall, 6-6 in conference. They had, missed a big part of their season due to, a COVID-19 pause. It's unclear whether or not a lot of those games will be made up, but they've got matchup against Oregon on Sunday. Huge game. Ducks obviously got to the Beavers pretty good in Corvallis earlier this season, fallen by 20. So I imagine Scott Rueck and the girls will be very fired up to want to close out the season with a win and try to really give themselves a chance to be in that postseason picture. And then last but not least, baseball. I know a lot of edgers were really excited. You could see it on the board this last weekend. Saw some names come back out of the woodwork that I haven't seen in a minute. So I'm very excited that baseball's back open. And the Beavers, after dropping the opener to Kansas State, really turned it on for the rest of the weekend. Ended up beating New Mexico twice in Gonzaga. They sit 3-1 and are heading into a road trip against Grand Canyon this week. Not a bad deal for them, Jared. They go down and hang out in Arizona and then get to go to Grand Canyon. So a couple weeks down in sunny Arizona for the baseball team, man. They know how to travel.
Probably a nice little break from the Oregon weather for those guys for sure.
Certainly. And again, they go 3-1 in that first weekend, stay down in Arizona for a 4-game trip. 4-game trip against Grand Canyon. Then the Beavers are back home the following weekend. So that'll go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Edge podcast. Big shout out to Jared Halus for joining me to be able to talk about AJ Steward. I know we're all very excited to see, what he's going to be able to do with this group and how he's going to be able to develop this roster and, something that we can't wait to see. So thanks, Jared, for joining on and talking about AJ. And I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction that continues to happen and seeing as AJ starts throwing out offers and all those things on the recruiting trail. And for all that stuff, just keep it locked right here at beaversedge.com.